with the warmest of welcomes to all of you. So good afternoon and welcome to our first virtual Juneteenth conversation hosted by the Department of African American and African Studies and History at Rutgers University-Newark and the Newark Public Library. Today we celebrate the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth, commemoration of the 1865 Declaration of Freedom for the last enslaved Black people in the United States. My name is Christina Strasberger and I'm the administrator of History and African American and African Studies. I wanted to hold this conversation, one, because I missed all of our alumni, but really because there's a lot of information and misinformation being circulated about this significant day in American history. And the intent is to engage our alumni and all of you in discussion about the significance of the day, particularly during these times. Now, before we begin, let us acknowledge the ancestral unceded territory of Lenape nations on which we are learning and working from today. Now, those of you who have watched any of the wonderful programs hosted by the James Brown African American Room and the Newark Public Library will have heard to fill out your census forms. So if you could please take a few moments to fill it out at my2020census.gov, because having this accurate population data is used to allocate resources that we desperately need. And in particular, Newark is less information collected than we would like. And we need to be counted. So representation matters. So I have assembled here today a wonderful group of alumni, and we've asked them a few questions. When did they first become aware of Juneteenth? What's their personal significance? How they celebrate, if they've celebrated, and why is it particularly resonant now? There'll be conversation about thoughts on it becoming a national holiday and anything else they'd like to share. So without further ado, I am going to just introduce our wonderful panelists. First is Reggie Blanding, our co-host, a double Rutgers University alumnus. He holds a bachelor's in history with a minor in African American studies here from Rutgers Newark and a master's of library science from New Brunswick. He's a librarian at the James Brown African American Room, the Newark Public Library. Michael Esquerre is an 8th grade social studies teacher at Orange Public School District, certified to teach grades K through 12, and has been teaching for 6 years. He holds a bachelor's in history and a master of arts for teachers from our Rutgers University-Newark Federated History program. Jonae Potter-Gill is also a double alumna from Rutgers University-Newark, where she earned her bachelor's in the areas of African American and African studies and social work. She has received her master's in clinical social work and graduating in advanced standing in May of 2019. She currently works with families who have been involved in the child welfare system as a clinician, providing therapeutic services as part of wraparound services to clients in supportive initiative at Family Connections, leading trauma-informed New Jersey nonprofit organization that provides mental health, addiction, family intervention, and reunification services. Now, Lacey Hunter, who received her bachelor's and her master of arts from teachers from our Federated History program and her PhD from Drew University. She's currently an instructor teaching courses on African American studies and Afro-American history. And you can catch her in the fall semester teaching interdisciplinary archival research methods, in addition to our introduction to African American and African studies courses. She's actively involved, as many of you will know, in organizations that help urban students transition into college and collaborative programs for at-risk college freshmen. She's deeply committed to restructuring historical teaching and encouraging greater literacy rates among students of color. Now, last but not least, Chris Williams, an alumnus also of Rutgers Newark with degrees in philosophy and African American and African studies. During his time as a hip hop researcher for the Muse Collaborative, he's reviewed albums and wrote about the general state of hip hop. He's a firm believer that theory must be connected to praxis. He's lectured high school students on critical race theory, rhetoric, and student-focused pedagogy. He's currently pursuing his degree in law at Washington University at St. Louis. His academic areas of interest are history, stand-up comedy, and psychoanalysis. Let us give them all our attention and thank them so much for participating in today's conversation. I'm going to share in the chat the link so you could read their full bios and more about them later on. We'll begin with Dr. Hunter to talk about the history and significance of the day. Please take it away.
So happy Juneteenth, everybody. I'm just going to be pretty brief, but for anyone who doesn't know, Juneteenth is the commemoration, the celebration of, as Christina mentioned earlier, the news of the news to the last waves of enslaved people in the United States, that they had been freed. And this news came about 2.5 years after the sort of passing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so since that year, or the year that that news came in 1865, Black communities in Texas, where it began, and certainly then after in places like Louisiana and Mississippi and other states, have continued remembering that news.
Would you like to add anything to that, Michael, who's also our 8th grade teacher? We'll unmute. Or any of our other panelists?
Yes, when we talk about the history of actually Texas, Texas was one of the last states to actually join America, and there was like a mass movement of people moving to Texas because of the land and the cotton, the growing of cotton within Texas. So a lot of people actually moved to Texas, and it was actually a place where people were trying to actually breed slaves, even though it was short lived. It was only about 20 years that Texas was a slave state. People were trying to go out there to actually start business, and they were actually very far removed from everybody, all the other states, because it was a fairly new state. So just some facts about it. They said about 30% of the Texas population were slaves. That's about 250,000 people. So 250,000 people is a lot of people who didn't get their freedom during the emancipation. They said about 1 in 4 families actually owned slaves within Texas, which is another fascinating. It wasn't like huge plantations, but families owned maybe 1 or 2, 2 or 3, 5 slaves, and business was booming for those slave owners in Texas.
Right.
Oh. All right. And I think you were asking, I know one of the questions is, when did we first learn about Juneteenth? So for me personally, I, did not know about Juneteenth until I moved out to Colorado. I worked at the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library out there in historic 5 Points, historic Black neighborhood in that area. And I think I just remember showing up to work one day and there being stands with like turkey legs and, just like excitement in the air and people out and about. And, I think I may have learned about it prior to, but I didn't understand just how big it was out there in that area. I grew up here in New Jersey, and, Juneteenth was just the day between the 10th and the 19th, 11th or 12th, 13th, 19th. So there I learned, the big connection, particularly there, because people, in Colorado, there's a big Texas population there. So in that area, that particular impact of this day was really felt there. So it's interesting to be back here now on the East and sort of see how it's developed and sort of grown throughout the years. This was in 2005 when I started working in Denver. And a colleague who I reached out to this morning, she just told me their biggest celebration for Juneteenth was in this past year, just last year. So, it's been interesting to kind of learn about it and see how it's gotten to this point today. So.
For me, my family actually didn't celebrate Juneteenth. We celebrated a related day of observance, which is Watch Night. And so I think for a lot of people whose family, a lot of Black families that are from the East Coast, Watch Night is more familiar. And it's a similar sort of history. You know, Watch Night is a night when in Black tradition, enslaved people stayed up all night on New Year's Eve, waiting for news of their freedom. And it's also connected to, you know, these other traditions that are linked to Methodism, things that are sort of born out of the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And so I was kind of familiar from that perspective. And it wasn't until I think I was maybe about 15 or 16 when one of my closest friends, her family, who has roots in the Southwest, they celebrated Juneteenth. And so she kind of brought me into a better understanding of what the term meant and why it was important for her family to celebrate it every year.
Yeah, I think for me, my experience was similar to everybody else's. I think over the years, I heard murmurs of this holiday or this day called Juneteenth. And, you know, like just last week, I had a colleague ask me, he said, you know, what's Juneteenth? Because he does like these monthly like birthday shout outs and the holidays in that month. And he said, you know, to me, like, what is that? You know, and, you know, I gave an explanation, but I think it hasn't been accessible to us, like just the knowledge of the holiday, what Juneteenth is about. My job, Family Connections, actually, you know, declared today a day off. And so many of us are off today and therefore can celebrate it. But like I said, if you're working, how can you celebrate a holiday, right, that you're not even available for? So I think when I first like really began to understand the significance probably was at Rutgers, like in my Black Studies courses, whether that was undergrad, my long journey in undergrad. But yeah, so I think just that significance of it, like really didn't come to me until I was, you know, took on Black Studies as a major.
I'm actually the same as everyone else. I learned about Juneteenth when I was in college. I took a history of the Civil War course, and I wasn't really familiar when I first heard Juneteenth. They said it freed slaves in Texas, so I just thought it was another name for the Emancipation Proclamation. But then moving forward, I realized when I was doing my research that it's actually happened 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was something that was actually shocking to me, especially being undergrad, because I always thought that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. Moving forward, when I'm actually in class and I'm teaching about Juneteenth, it's actually very interesting because that's actually an essential question that I ask my students about the Emancipation Proclamation. Did Abraham Lincoln free the slaves? And the students always say yes, just like how I said yes when I was a young adult. And when they do their research and they come upon Juneteenth, they realize, like, listen, all the slaves weren't free from the Emancipation Proclamation. And it kind of causes this like idea that moves forward into Reconstruction and sets the tone for the next 150 years about, did slaves actually become free after the Civil War? And that is something that is very important that we have to teach our students, because I didn't really know about Juneteenth. And this is actually my really first year celebrating Juneteenth. And what better way to celebrate Juneteenth than being on a panel talking about Juneteenth? This is actually the first time where I've seen so many people online, social media, different companies that are actually giving time off and granting paid days off for this day. So the time is now. So it's actually pretty powerful. So moving forward, I definitely want to keep celebrating and moving forward.
So my story is a little different. I don't remember when I first heard about Juneteenth, but I did pick up on that that dog whistle of Trump resuming the campaign in Tulsa on Juneteenth. So there was some awareness of it in the back of my mind. And I think that that's something that's worth being interested about. I mean, like I have a degree in Afro studies from a grade school that's like Wendell Holbrook. I don't know if he's here, but he's amazing. Like, he was a phenomenal teacher. I had Professor Hunter to me. I'm not going to call you Lacey as a professor. So like I had phenomenal teachers, but even then I still didn't know about it, you know. So I think it's still important to realize that it's important to, you know, keep historical moments alive because they can be forgotten.
Right.
I Once I found out about it, I did a little research. I found the importance of like drinking strawberry soda and whatnot, but I really don't know a date. But I will say one of the things that I made the connection to immediately after reading about Juneteenth was the what does the 4th of July mean to the slave essay, which was something that I was thinking about through undergrad onward. Because again, I didn't really have a Black history in my high school, you know. If no one's read that essay, it's something like
What to the slave is the 4th of
what to
July?
the slave is
Yes.
the 4th of July? Yeah, great, very short, very poignant, you know, and it's animated. It's something that's still relevant today. I think, especially on holidays like this one. Yeah, I guess it's a long way to say I don't know.
I think what you said is beautiful, Chris. And I recommend for everybody who's a part of this conversation today, please read that particular essay by Frederick Douglass. It has a beautiful dry wit, but also this kind of wonderful, like, cut right through the tension in American holidays or national holidays. That is it's just absolutely fantastic. So definitely, I think, read that. But I would say, just to kind of add and build on what you all have said, that there's something really important in Juneteenth in that it's about remembrance, and that we do that in different ways in our communities. You know, it's not always collective. Sometimes it's very, very intimate. It's within the settings of our backyards, at the cookout. Sometimes, you know, it's those three-way calls that are linked to 12 other three-way calls. You know, somebody out here will know what I'm saying, where, you know, you're kind of like, you're reaching out to those who are sort of metaphorically lost to you for a time, right? Like you don't get to talk to them for very long, and so on and so forth. And for others, you know, it's like you get your full-on parade experience, or it's a part of your church celebration, your temple celebration, or in the community that, you know, I went through my teenage years in, it was like the local library happened to have a Black librarian, which was a first to me. At that point in my life, and she just kind of made sure that there was always Juneteenth programming during the month of June, which was like fantastic.
Word. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I have a colleague from my first library trying to get on, but I think we're at capacity here, so I'm gonna tell her to go to the Facebook feed. Yeah, an interesting point brought up to me, or that I came across earlier, and I'm gonna give credit to the sister Raina. She kind of said, "What are we celebrating today?" You know, and then of course, you know, mentioned that, you know, if anything, you know, it's something else to think about. Slavery has just, in a sense, been rebranded. And I don't know if we wanted to jump into this part of this, but this feels like a necessary component of the conversation as well. You know, of course, now we look at the prison population and what's taken place, continue to take place and grown out of debt peonage and, you know, that area. So that was, I think there's still a field of approaches to this day. You know, some people, you know, I'm of mind of where we can celebrate the victories, but we also have to acknowledge that there are still miles to go. So I'm curious if anybody else, you know, has anything within that line of thinking.
I definitely think there's definitely a long way that we have to go. If you look at other holidays, Dr. Martin Luther King Day, there's Black History Month where we always talk about Black success. But the problem is that it can definitely not stop there. It can't just stop with the holiday. We definitely have to move forward and implement new policies that everybody can have equality, whether it's educational or job opportunities, We talk about the police. One of the reasons why we're here is because of the police brutality and having different programs set up so that police officers can have cultural or historical insight on maybe the demographic where they work, and different things like that. So it definitely doesn't just stop with just a holiday. I think it's a good start. It's definitely a good start, but there needs to be policies and laws that pretty much change the narrative, right? Because there's like this notion, even before George Floyd, the incident with George Floyd, there's a notion that, oh, racism doesn't exist, right? This idea of like only a few bad apples or a few, right? So when you talk about a few, it works on either opposite end of the spectrum, right? So when the police say it's only a few bad apples, it looks like, oh, it's not everyone, right? But then when we talk about inclusion and we talk about African American inclusion, it's like, well, there's a few African Americans who made it, became billionaires, that have education. So there's no such thing as racism, right? So this idea of few is on each side of each spectrum, which kind of causes a problem, right? So with social media and everything that's happening in the last month, it's bringing light to those and it's unmasking the real issues that are going on. That yes, racism does exist, even though it's not, we're not in shackles and chains. It's more insidious, right? So it's hidden. So we're actually trying to knock that down because getting back to police brutality, if there's no video of what happened, it's their word versus our word, right? So now people are seeing it. And even when we've seen it the last couple years, it still hasn't really resonated with a lot of people. So it's like we have to kind of like keep pushing for this and keep pretty much riding this till the wheels fall off until change is made.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I'd like to say, I really like metaphors. They are good at getting a point across. It's like a pet peeve. I'm not disagreeing with you, but it's a pet peeve when people get metaphors wrong. And I just want to use this time to say, I think people forgot what the bad apple metaphor means, right? If you have a bushel of apples and you have one bad apple, that whole bushel is bad.
Right.
Whatever fungus or whatever bugs were eating on that apple, then eat all the other apples, right? So I feel like people say, yes, police departments have a few bad apples. That's it. That's the point.
Right.
Get the bad apples out because they will influence everybody else. You know, it's like common sense, birds of a feather flock together. You are your 5 people that you hang around with. If your best buddy is cop killer, like, you know, cop is killing people, he shouldn't be on the force because maybe he will influence the other good apples, you know.
Yeah.
So when you hear people, because we are at a point where rhetoric is becoming deadlocked. People just exchange phrases that are not even like really understanding what things mean. Like I'll say Black Lives Matter, and they'll be like all lives matter. You know, I simply have to say, well, look, if you think about set theory, all refers to all things within a set. So Black would be a subset of the all. Like, you know, so like sometimes it's important to like really think about the meaning of the words that we're using instead of just deploying them, you know.
Right. I would add to that. I feel like there's something important in remembering that maybe we shouldn't be calling this a holiday. Like, you know, it's not necessarily a holiday. And to your point earlier, Reggie, about celebration, I don't know that folks are celebrating as much as they are kind of honoring and remembering, right? Like we're not going shopping for linens, right, on Juneteenth, right? We're coming together. And in that coming together, we reflect. And I think when we use a term like, should we make it a national holiday? To some degree, we're missing the point, right? Like it's more along the terms of like what we think about if you acknowledge Veterans Day or Memorial Day, right, or Labor Day. If you do that in a sort of significant way, right, and you think about like why are we taking this day out as a nation to take time and spend with our families, or take time and reflect, or understand a little bit more about, you know, the journey that we've been on as a nation or as a community or as a family. And I think Juneteenth is well in accordance with that type of day, right? So that, yes, we remember the things we've overcome, but we also remember the things that we still have to overcome, right? Police brutality being one of those things, right? And I think if we think about it more as like a day of remembrance rather than a day of celebration, or entirely a day of celebration, that it can help more people get the point of why we're calling for it.
Right. I agree. I think like when I asked myself, like, should we make it a national holiday? I thought about, but how do we want to acknowledge it? Because do we need another holiday to be celebrated in the way that we typically celebrate, holidays in this country, like you said, through spending and, discounts on things. I mean, hey, if proceeds for Juneteenth, like I wanted to purchase a Juneteenth t-shirt, but I was very concerned of who I was going to be purchasing it from. Like, is this online seller truly Black owned, and how will those monies be applied? And I think if anything, the day should be about, like, I was reading a little bit about the National Black Conventions and things like that, where people gather to really, like, let's put some action, forth, and let's, get together and talk about policy and, the changes, because a quote that came up to my mind, everybody knows it: justice delayed is justice denied. And that's essentially what Juneteenth was, right? It was delayed justice, delayed freedom. And for me, I have some dissonance when I see celebrate freedom, on the banners of, or the Juneteenth banners that I've seen, because it's like, we're not really free, It's, to me, it should be about, like, how do we move towards integrity of what the day should be of celebrating, Excuse me, my nerves. Thank you all for being here. But yeah, yeah, I just think we just need to be mindful, especially in this time where a lot of people are making demands, right? We want this, we want that. But understanding so this is the social worker in me, like, the process of how policies are developed need to be handled with care, because it's easy to say, oh yeah, executive order, Juneteenth's a holiday, or executive order, we're defunding the police, but what are you doing in that gap, to make it sustainable? And yes, to make it sustainable and to reach the goals that we're setting out to achieve with those demands.
I agree 100% with what you're saying, because I also feel like if they give us a holiday, or if they give us Juneteenth, then it's like, okay, we give you this, now you guys can be quiet now, right? It kind of like stops. It kind of like stops the movement of what we're actually trying to accomplish, which is new policy and everything that comes with it, everything in between. So it's not like just give them this holiday and they shut up. No, we can't really let that happen. So I understand exactly what you're saying.
Exactly, to appease. We're not looking for someone to appease us.
My thoughts on Juneteenth as a holiday or as a day of remembrance, for me, it's really a both and sort of thing, which is a lot of the context of Black joy.
Yes.
Right.
Like Martin Luther King Day, great holiday, state murdered him,
Right.
But the thing is, I think that when we celebrate, it's important that there are historians, but we're not celebrating as historians. There's something about this holiday that is animated in the time we have now. So like when I think of Juneteenth and that strange blend of joy, because people got freed, like that is worth celebrating. Like it is worth celebrating. And as abolitionists today, we need those moments of like, this shit might actually lead to some people being able to be, human. We also have, it's also a moment of justice deferred. Like Juneteenth should not be a holiday, just straight up. Like everybody that was in Texas should have been freed under the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So it's weird to celebrate a day that shouldn't be recognized in that respect, and that's what I'm thinking through.
Yeah.
So like, my mom is in. Hi, Mom. So my thing is like, I think of Juneteenth as two things. One, in the light of the the protests and what have you, the problem of Black joy, because we can talk about the theoretical value of and the theoretical and historical value of Juneteenth, but at the end of the day, like somebody celebrating in their backyard might get the cops called on them.
Right.
So that's how do you negotiate that that tightrope walk of being joyful and still being amidst anti-blackness, you know.
Right.
Like the first thing I think about is the kid who got killed by a white guy because he was playing music too loud in his car, you know, or a kid gets shot because they had like a toy gun, you know. So like, and to loop that back into discussions of the protests, one of the things that I would see often, now I'm not encouraging violent protests, just as like the caveat, that's the law school talking, but one of the reasons I would see is, oh no, we shouldn't be encouraging violent protests because then that'll give them a reason to attack us. And I think it's important to combat that because remember, the violence that is put upon Black flesh is gratuitous. There's no reason, you know, you don't need a reason to attack Black folks. Like the 13-year-old who got arrested for jaywalking.
Right.
The jaywalking wasn't the reason, it was the excuse, right? So it's important to remember that even if we were to celebrate our ancestors being freed, there's the threat of the cops being called on us, right? So I think that it's important when we think about Juneteenth and Black joy, it's important to we worry about policing how people express happiness when they can, because it's rough sometimes, you know. And to the second point about justice being deferred, first off, happy Pride Month, you know.
Right.
It's a beautiful thing. I'm sorry
Right.
that there wasn't a parade, but it's important to have moments to be like something beautiful happened and we can memorialize that. And my heart goes out to women who are also Black women who are also disproportionately killed, and trans folks who are also disproportionately killed, but their names aren't said and vigils aren't held for them because of some respectability politics or issues within the community as far as valuing life. Because, you know, and when we say Black life, back to set theory, there's an implied all, you know, it's not just Black men that are valuable. So thinking about that, and in terms of like the 2.5 years that should not have taken place, like how do we think about the value of abolition now? You know, as we see places that sell weed pop up and like 80% of them are white owned, while people I grew up with are in jail for selling weed. Like, why aren't they being? I mean, they should have been lauded as businessmen. You know how hard it is to like start a business. But when we think about justice deferred, like if Juneteenth is going to be a day of remembrance, you remember in order to reflect, right? So think about it as a day to think, who else isn't at the table right now?
Right.
What can we do? And what can we do to ensure that they have a seat and that it's warm for them, that it's ready, you know? Because when you think about it, that's 2.5 years. You know how mad I would be if I worked at a job for 2.5 years without getting paid, and then want to see back pay? Not any back pay, you know. But that's just my thoughts on the issue.
I think that's so beautiful, Chris. As usual, you're so amazing. And I would say I think that is kind of. I guess I want to say that's what makes being Black in the United States and in many Western nations so interesting, is that so many of our so-called holidays are bittersweet, right? Like you're, you know, it's like, you know, you don't get your heroes or the anti-heroes or they're the villains until it's convenient, and they're not. You know, your dead are no longer remembered because somebody, you know, swept away or moved away or cleared away your spaces of remembrances on the street, in front of your house, whatever, right? Or in your community. And so you just kind of move from like this like ambiguous space to ambiguous space to ambiguous space, kind of reaching for as much joy as possible, but also realizing and recognizing that any full expression of your joy could mean violence towards you, right? And then on the other side, you kind of have this conversation that blames you for the violence, right? So it's sort of like, well, and I've actually heard this unfortunately too frequently, I don't believe that innocent people should die, but cops' lives matter too. And it's sort of like, no one's saying that their lives don't matter, you know, like we're asking for you to be careful, right? Because we've seen you be careful when your life is in danger in other instances. Like you can be a white man out in who knows where and take over federal property with arms and make it home, right? After you go through due process of the law. But you can't play your music too loud in front of your house and be a teenage Black male, right? And I think that those sort of, those contrasts are what make it really difficult to figure out how, you know, we move forward in celebrating Juneteenth. But also I think there's something really nice in that we can kind of leave it open, right? That it doesn't, we don't have to have a parade, but we can, right? And we don't have to be in somber, you know, remembrance, but we can be. And that mixture and that sort of gray space is also a part of Black history in this country and the history of many other marginalized people. And because I don't want to talk too much, Chris, I really like your last point. I think what we can do as what we can do is sort of like, you know, modern day abolitionists or civil rights activists to make sure that the table is as inclusive as possible is to stop trying to pick and choose what issues we're going to address, right? In what moment. I think unfortunately we do that too often, and it may be an extension of our bipartisan politics, you know, on a larger scale. But I think for Black people, because there are so many layers to the ways in which we are oppressed and the intersections of our identities, that we just kind of, we may have to just let go of, all right, well, we're going to talk about this because this person doesn't have a criminal record and they're also, you know, a father and they didn't have their pants sagging on that day and their hair was cut, or, you know, her hair was relaxed. She's not a teen mom, she's married, right? So we can talk about her. I think we have to kind of let go of a lot of that so that we can hear all the voices at once, because they don't negate each other.
So we actually have a couple of, a lot of comments and a good number of questions. This one I really, from Mary Rivera, I think this is a really interesting question. It speaks to the points made earlier. My son, dark skin, cost him a bad beatdown by police a few years ago. What can we do to teach our children what's going on with people who are supposed to be protecting them and such? I mean, that speaks to the conversation that Mike was talking about earlier also as a teacher. What would you recommend? And again, what Chris said about if there are celebrations, if you are just trying to live and be, what advice would you give?
Well, I think it goes to the point of equality, right? So on July 4th or Memorial Day weekend, there's tons of parties. There's parties everywhere. People are partying, people are doing whatever they please. So the holiday may not be necessarily for the independence of America or Memorial Day remembering the soldiers, but they took that holiday and they create their own idea about what it is. So I feel like when we talk about holidays, I feel like we should be able to take it how we want, and we can do it all. We don't just necessarily have to educate, even though that's number one important, but we can still have a little fun, because I do think it's important that freedom is important and we should definitely celebrate it. To the question about how should we interact with police officers, that is actually a great question. And I feel like that's something that they need to be able to do within the police academy and within the police union. I feel like they have to police themselves. And even though that it's not happening right now, that's something that we have to push for them to actually do. Because just because you look a certain way doesn't mean that you have to be treated a certain way, right? So if someone sees me, I have a master's degree, I'm an educator, but they may come to me like, yo, he looks like somebody I know from somewhere else, and he looks like pretty much stereotyping who I am, right? So I think that actually starts from within the police force, and that's something that they should actually want to do. They should want to champion that, especially now. They should, as bad as they look right now, they should be open to everything right now, because it keeps happening over and over and over again. And they should want to actually see and make changes. But as we know, when we go back to that bad apple, right? We have cops that are showing solidarity for cops that are killing people and they're running away, and they're in Atlanta and they're leaving the force, or in Buffalo they push the older guy down and then they're like, oh, we're not going to be part of the riot. Whatever it was, we're not going to be part of it anymore. So it's like they're sticking together for wrongdoing, right? So that is actually a learning that we need to use as a teachable moment and a learning point that, listen, how are you guys going to address this? What is being said? I don't know anyone who talks about this stuff. We talk about police brutality, but we're not at those tables at the police academy. We're not at those tables at the police union. Like, when are their meetings? When can we address this stuff? Like, we're protesting at our city halls, we're walking, but when can we be able to actually take it to the people who are actually training these people, right? Because clearly they need they need a lot. History, like I said before, I guess historical analysis of what America is like social and emotional learning, empathy. Like, what can we bring to the table so that they're not just walking around like, oh, I'm just a big bad cop, I can do whatever I want. So that's something that we have to kind of think about as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely, I agree. And oh, I'm sorry, Tim.
nah, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, I just absolutely, and I think neighborhood, accountability and having groups that are overseeing the people that are in these neighborhoods is definitely a key step. For me myself, I grew up in, when I lived in Camden, New Jersey, I knew the local neighborhood cop when I was a kid. My mother, she was in law enforcement, although there's also that part of her that instilled in me, although I saw her coming home from work as a cop at certain times, if I was going to be running out in the streets, she also would give me warnings, watch what you're getting into. And it wasn't about the other people in the neighborhood. It might be about, the people on patrol. So I think instilling, to Mary's point, which I think is, what can we do to teach our children? There is some cautiousness that was instilled to me in that sense. It's unfortunate, but it feels like it's a necessity to, make them aware. Just all these people in badges are not necessarily there to serve and protect you. The FBI report from years ago, which talked about infiltration from supremacist groups. It's scary, but and if you look at I think the captain in the Minneapolis case, he's got links to a group in Chicago and Nazi regalia, things like that. So unfortunately, it's things like that in the mix as well, where even if you're talking to some of these cats, there's already an ideology baked in to they're not, but at the same time, there's also just the matter of respectability for people who may be in the police force and on the fence and don't understand respectable interaction. So yeah, I would say just overall, to boil it down to Mary's point, just to it's instill that to a child earlier. It's not, maybe if it's not all in the neighborhood, to still be cautious and be aware that there's potential danger.
So what I was going to say to Mary's point was, like, so my son is about to turn 14 years old. And I would say over the past few years, there's been a heightened awareness of, certain conversations that I've had with them or may need to have with them. And how I do that is important to me, because I don't want him to think of himself as a threat, right? And present himself in such a way where he's, walking on eggshells around himself, right? Where he's not free to wear the hoodie if he wants to, and all of these things, right? Play his music in his car. Like I was listening to, I was listening to Umi by, my God, I'm having a brain fart right now. But
Most def.
Y'all already know. So, I'm listening, and he said, I want my people to be free, free, right? Meaning that I want my son to be free. I want to have that privilege, and it shouldn't be a privilege, but that piece of allowing him to be as he wants to be when he goes out into the world. But the reality is, like Reggie said and Michael said, like, we have to prepare our sons. And I think it has to be considered in our systems, like our are the administrators and the workers, are they trauma informed? Are we, implementing trauma informed policing strategies? Are the officers trained in mental health first aid? These are the things that I think we have to really, really address and consider, because to me, I really have a problem with the pressure has been on the parents. Like, talk to your sons about being Black males. How about you talk to the schools, like Michael brought up, the social emotional learning, because my son went to a school in Newark, but many of his teachers were white women, right? And like, and I wonder, how much do they know about young Black men, about young Black children, about Black families and their experiences in their communities? Like, how aware are they? Is it just a 9-to-5 exposure, or do you really, have some kind of connection? So I think just that, and what it does, and just thinking about, and I like how Chris brought up, like, we should be able to celebrate, because when I think about what it must do to us psychologically to, for centuries, not have a day where we can just celebrate, right? Just celebrate who we are as a people. Yeah, we have Black History Month, but, again, it comes with that somberness, it comes with that heaviness, but there's also a lot of pride with that, because like when I thought about enduring the coronavirus and all, I thought about, well, my ancestors had to have made through this, because I made it through this because I'm here. Right. So I think it's important that with our children, you definitely instill pride, instill awareness, but also convict whatever systems they're a part of, whether that's their school system, whether that's you going to your council meetings, city council meetings, and, raising your voice on that platform. But yeah.
One thing that I saw a comment pop up about non-people of color or white. And that's something that I feel like that should be on the opposite end of the spectrum too, because we keep talking about our sons, our Black sons, right? Our sons, our daughters, but then what are they teaching their kids as well, right? So what are they doing in their school systems, or what are they saying at home about what is going on, about killings, right? So we're still focused on our culture, which is understandable, but what are they doing on their end, right? So what are they teaching? Because I could teach my son to talk properly, say certain things, don't get aggressive, stay out of trouble, right? He does everything right, and then he has that one interaction, right? So the police officer, my son is 3, he'll be 4 next month. But then by the time he's like 18, 19, the police officers are going to be the people who are there now and the younger generation. So what are we doing for like the 14 to, I guess, 30-year-olds for the next, I guess, 15, 20 years? What's going to happen with that? Because that I feel like that's very important. We can have all the conversations we want, but it needs to be a two-way street. It just can't be us telling us, don't interact with the cops this way, don't do this, don't do that. I feel like they need to tell their kids as well that, listen, we don't harm other people. Just because he looks this way doesn't mean, let's not stereotype, right? Because when we look at culture, and we definitely look at African American Black culture, it's all on the television, right? So we're watching basketball, football, stars, whatever it is. We love LeBron James, but then this guy who may be 6 foot, I'm scared of him in real life. Like, it shouldn't be like that. So I think it should be definitely a two-way street on how we approach it. So I think that it just can't be us talking about it. I think that it needs to be on that end as well.
I completely agree. And I think there's something interesting about sort of like the many cultures of silence that exist in this country, right? Because on the one hand, Black people up to, I want to say the most recent moments, maybe the last 15 or 20 years, like we haven't really talked to non-Black people about the fact that we have those conversations with our children, not just our sons, but our daughters, right? And for young women, it's more like, well, don't dress like this, don't put on too much makeup, don't, natural hair, if you're gonna have it natural, it needs to be neat, right? Like those kinds of conversations that we have in private. And I think that to some degree that sort of facilitates what you said, Jonae, like the psychological damage of being afraid of whatever your true self or the enactment of your true self might be, right? And I think to Reggie, to your colleague, I'm going to be super pessimistic here, which is not what I would normally do, but I have follow-up, so it's all right. I don't think that there's a right thing that we can teach our sons and daughters, because what we have seen historically is that it doesn't. You could have on an Armani suit, a beautiful tailored Armani suit, and your hair be fresh and be almost passable and still find yourself in a fatal situation. And on the other side, you can, you know, be whoever we imagine the regular Joe Schmo is, or Jane Schmo, right? And still find yourself in a fatal situation. I'm not sure that there's a protocol, right? And I think that in and of itself is like a profound problem for us as like people of color in this country. And it speaks to what you say, Jonae, right? Like, it's hurtful to have to tell your son or your nephews or your nieces or whomever that they need to be cautious of how they behave, how they respond, understanding that at the end of the day, that doesn't make a difference, right? But I think what we can do, again, to your colleague and to anyone who has this question, is I think we do have to like create more spaces for conversation. Sort of like what you said, Michael, like we need to be talking to, in very honest and raw ways, our neighbors who we normally don't talk to about these issues. And we need to be talking to the police, because I don't think that it's entirely their responsibility. I don't think that any entity in and of itself should be left with the responsibility of figuring out what justice is going to be. It has to be collaborative, especially if we want, you know, multiple people at the table and, you know, different voices at the table. I think we just have to figure out a way to sit down and listen as much as we talk, right? So that the next time someone stops our sons, our daughters, whatever, they hopefully, right, can conjure in their minds those conversations, and maybe they ask a question before they rest their hand on their weapon.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
So, I'm not a parent, to my knowledge. So this is really hard to like imagine somebody teaching this. But this is just something that I've experienced, and I don't know if it's an answer, but it's something I find helpful. I think that there's a certain degree where like the focus shouldn't be on the people who have a problem. Like they clearly have a problem. You know, I think it's a Toni Morrison line. Like if the only way you can see yourself as being tall is if other people have their knees cut, then the problem is with you, you know, sort of thing. Or like there's this phenomenal Baldwin interview where he was talking about the use of can I say the N-word here? The N-word, whatever. And like he ended with this beautiful rhetorical flourish. He was like, you need a nigger for you to be valuable. You're the nigger. That's your problem. You know, that's not me. And practically, like, you know, I was working in a very dangerous environment. I looked very, you know, Black Air Force One energy. I was wearing a cardigan. I was paralegal at a law firm. I was making a phone call to like my mom on break. And somebody was like strong Karen energy. She walked out. I was in the back of the firm. She was like, hey, I just wanted to make sure, like, you work here? You know? And it's like, which is why, like, if I don't know you, I assume you are the police. I mean, that's just one thing. Like, one thing you just, because you always have to, on some level, be aware. Because, you know, somebody might be, you know, you standing there menacingly, and, you know, and then something happens. But also, it's important to remember that people police us enough. We don't need to police ourselves. And, like, it's important to not drill fear into kids, because they're kids. And
Right.
for adults, they don't need that. I remember I was at the same firm, and it was a well-meaning attorney who took me under his wing, and he just one day I was just walking through the hallway, and he said, hey, you know, like, pick your head up, you know, you look, what you need to, he said, you need to look like you deserve to be here. And that was something that clearly sticks with me to this day, you know. And I think that it's important for me to realize that I need to at least feel as if I need to feel as if I belong here if I'm wearing a suit, if I'm wearing a jersey, if I'm wearing sweatpants, if I'm wearing slacks, be they wool or what have you, because at the end of the day, the focus isn't on appearing safe enough to not be attacked. You know, the focus should be on never forgetting the value that we have. You know, so like as important as it is to have discussion saying, hey, remember, other things happen. Sometimes other people just be wilding, you know. And as kids, like it's really easy to internalize that and say, since they thought that I looked aggressive, I must have looked aggressive. What could I have done to look safer? I think that an important thing for parents to do is say, no, this isn't about you being messed up. It's just you're in a world where I can't always protect you. And when I can't protect you, sometimes you have to protect yourself. And sometimes it looks like saying, you know what? It doesn't matter if I'm wearing a t-shirt. I deserve to walk around in the streets, you know. And it's hard to I wish there was a easy like ticket answer, but like it's something we all experience and struggle with, you know. So I think it's important to continue to have discussions about it, because I think the tendency to self-police is a monster.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. Just something I caught in within there out of all the jewels just dropped. That building of you know, just to add a little positive, you know, extra positive note to the light, is a building of self-worth. Very, very crucial. You know, for me, I tend to lean into a lot of history of resilience and you know, positive, you know, I'll read the negatives and get, you know, sort of downtrodden and, you know, like it'll eat at my soul, but then also remember there's a history of great resilient figures out there to lean into. And I think imparting that sense of self-worth is definitely just as paramount as you said, you know, just imparting like straight, you know, be cautious and fearful. So yeah, definitely. Oh.
So as we're actually, this conversation has moved so quickly, and thank you all so much for participating. We're almost out of time. There's Jonae, hold that up again.
Let's go.
Yes. I keep all my books, y'all. I don't give any away. So this is just for, I mean, Reggie brought up resistance. So this is a book called Rituals of Resistance. So if you need a read to inspire that in you, here you go. I'll put the author in the chat.
Thank you for that. And I'm glad you mentioned that about books, as this in these times you'll see so many book lists about anti-racism and things to read. Well, the lists are wonderful, and our School of Arts and Sciences compiled one, and I know the Newark Public Library compiled one, but you actually have to read them to get any of the information there. So it's wonderful to have these collections, but it's not shelf help, it's supposed to be our help. So I would encourage you that with all that's going on, and I know you're all working and there's this pandemic still and resistance and such, but it starts with all of us. I know that one of the questions that we talked about at the start was, when did you first learn? That's an excellent book, and it's available for free on Spotify. So for the next, I think, month. But again, if you have any questions or anything, I would definitely encourage you all to read. We have resources that are posted, our faculty, our alumni. We hope that there might be opportunity for other conversations if they would be willing to come back and join us. I do want to point out things that our faculty, including Henry Rutgers professor Salamisha Tillett, she did a wonderful interview yesterday. I'm going to post the link in the comments on the significance of Juneteenth also in this moment with Vice News. I thought that was a really engaging conversation too. And also now, if you may have seen, the city of Newark, Mayor Baraka announced that today for city employees, they won't be having Juneteenth off, but rather on. And they're having a teach-in that includes alumni and our faculty member, Associate Professor Melissa Cooper. So before we part, do you think that having teach-ins and really stressing the importance of the day might be something that other city officials would really do well to adopt? You know, just any of your parting thoughts on that and anything else that you might like to share? I see you shaking your head. Should I kick to you, Dr. Hunter?
Sure. 100%. We need teach-ins. We need anything that can, encourage the kind of dialogue that we're so sorely lacking in. And I would hope that cities that have those kind of underlying racial tensions would take a note, and that they would follow suit with people leading the conversations who are qualified to do so, and inviting people who might not ordinarily come on their own, right? Like making it a space where you could really get vulnerable and really have a full conversation.
I don't know. I guess in party thoughts, one thing I think about a lot now is, we're in a particular moment. Like this is, Juneteenth is, it's trending. Everything is big. We have the pandemic going on. There's no sports on TV. We have Maniac running the show. Maniac is the nicest word I can come up with right now. But, and I've had people in my inbox, what can I do? What recommendations? And my thing is, this is a lifelong thing. If some sense of normalcy is restored, whenever it's restored, to be hopeful, the fight still continues. And I think people, even, new allies, that's the thing is, when the playoffs are on, someone's still getting harassed. Someone's still, there's still injustice going on. And I also always just, I taught myself a long time ago to even look outside of our borders. Black Lives Matter is strong. And, there's, I think, about 600 people in Brazil just this year who have been either harassed or killed. So I think also just being mindful of the struggle worldwide outside of our borders, but and most importantly is just keeping that, whatever fight you feel right now in you, when the distractions all rise up and the movie theaters open again, just keep this in mind, keep that same energy, as they say. It gets tiring, but it's for the greater good, and it's worth it to continue.
I think that education on days like Juneteenth are important, because you have to remember that the history that you get taught in high school really paints enslaved people as docile subjects. They were enslaved, then they were freed by good old progress, voting, all that jazz. And I think that Juneteenth is also an occasion to talk about resistance. It's a great day to talk about marooning. It's a great day to talk about Black folks who are on the forefront shooting for their freedom, because one thing that I think is beautiful, and you see this in the Anthony Farley. I think he's at Rutgers now. Look at y'all moving up. No, but reading his stuff on the Haitian Revolution, and he was talking about one of the lines that always stuck with me. He said, paraphrasing, that the problem is that the fires didn't cross the waters. But there's also a certain respect in which they did. That resilience, that the way that Blackness manifests itself as, you can't push me down. It's still here, and it is really easy to turn Juneteenth into a you had to wait to be free holiday. And that's something that worries me, because that potential is there, in the same way that the legacy of Martin Luther King talking about civil disobedience and boycotting, economic disruption, got turned into, can we all just get along? So we have to be vigilant about the way that the holiday gets spun, especially as the federal government gets involved. Like if it becomes a federal holiday, because there's always been something wrong when I see a McDonald's commercial that's like Happy MLK Day.
Mm.
Agreed that happened Juneteenth.
Yes.
I'd like to just point out one thing. There was a wonderful comment from Daniel. Thank you everyone for making the space for allies, and I learned a lot today and wished we had another hour. So I felt too that this moved very, very quickly with all of you. And I know that some of our panelists, as we try to be respectful of everyone's time, but if any of you that are here have questions and want to share them, I know that some of our panelists kindly agreed to stay a little bit longer. One question that came up that I really think speaks a lot to what Jonae was talking about earlier about her son, Amen, who is just wonderful, and congratulations on graduation again.
Thank you.
And that is like about internalized racism. So I know that we didn't fully talk a lot about that, but the ideas of how we're internalizing and how we're projecting. Do you all want to speak a little bit about that if we have a little bit more time? And anyone want to talk about? Oh, go ahead.
So wait, are you framing it as a question? How do we cope with those things, or? You're on
I
mute.
will frame it how the question was, is there's time to talk about internalized racism, but I do frame it as a question. How do you all feel? What are your thoughts? Anything you want to share? It's a large question that I don't really think we can do proper in the time that we have. But if you had some things that you might want to talk about, and just really to give a couple more ideas to as we move on, and as we look and hopefully read on some of those books about anti-racism, we can also think a little bit more about our roles and how we're feeling now. Does that answer?
Yes. Yes. Anybody want to go first before I jump on my soapbox?
It's quick. I just wanted to say, like, and shout out. I went to Mother Seton Regional, which is it's an all-girls Catholic high school in Clark, New Jersey. Many alum can, attest to experiencing racist, incidents, while attending there. However, I want to shout out a few people that I have seen from like the class of 71, just like who showed up. And I just want to encourage those of you who are in this space as allies to keep showing up. I think many people come to us like, well, what should we do? What should, the answer be? And sometimes the answer is just showing up, keep showing your interest. So that just makes me happy to see, and people from my job who are not people of color, but they are in attendance. So,
Christina, I was gonna say, I think from my perspective, maybe the biggest issue in terms of like not just Black people, but people of color addressing issues of internalized racism is that we don't often acknowledge it, or we don't realize it until it's a little too late, or until we're already in, later stages of our development. And I think for Black communities, for other communities of color and other marginalized communities, and for allies, it's important to remember that process is like a continuous unlearning, right? That you're constantly unlearning things that you have either consciously or subconsciously been conditioned to believe about yourself. And that I think that makes for, at least in my own journey, that has made for a very, very kind of topsy-turvy dance of like, can I be my absolute self when I'm in a classroom if there's, a majority of white students in there or non-Black students in there? Something that I was thinking about maybe a couple of years ago that I talked through with a friend was like, I recognize that when I walk into some classrooms that are diverse, that most of my students have been taught, we don't want to be friends with Black women. We don't date Black women. We don't marry Black women. They have too much attitude, and on and on and on and on and on. And so it's like, on the one hand, to kind of think about that, right? But also try and be passionate about what I do for a living, or stay invested, right? And it is like, it's a balance, but it requires me to sort of constantly unlearn those things, to stop thinking about those things, and in order to be fair to my students and to give them the best experience possible, or to anybody, right? To treat anybody really well and the way that I want to be treated, that unlearning process has to just keep going. So yeah, I mean, I think that's worth thinking about always.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all. Thank our panelists again. And thank all of you for coming, for being engaged, for asking questions. You know, for me, I didn't grow up knowing about Juneteenth either. And I think it's also a somber day, but one that we do need to remember. It's an important event in our history. You know, it's part of American history. And I think that I'm indebted to all of you for answering the call so quickly. We put this conversation together very, very fast. And again, I just want to mention that we do have, we'll be compiling also a list of books, but of resources about the day on our websites. And again, we have faculty and students doing this work all the time. This isn't new. Juneteenth isn't new because it became to the surface. This has obviously been around and celebrated since 1866. So thank you all again for joining us, our panelists. Round of applause for all of you.
Thank you for the input.
And however you celebrate, whatever you choose to do this weekend, please be safe. We thank you. And a big shout out also really quickly to Beth, Zach Cohen from the North Public Library for going back and forth from the Facebook page to chat to make sure that we're all included in knowing what's happening. Thanks again, and have a good rest of the day. Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth, everybody.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.